Hallo und herzlich willkommen. Hier lernst du alles rund um das Thema Investor Relations, Fundraising und Kapitalmarkt. Mein Name ist Julia Stötzl und ich bin Gründerin und CEO von Investor Relations Beratung Unicorn. Unicorn ist davon eine Mission, Investor Relations für die nächste Generation einzuführen. Das bedeutet ganz konkret die Integration von digitalen Medien wie zum Beispiel LinkedIn, Podcast, Newsletter in die klassische Kapitalmarktarbeit. Mehr Informationen zu Unicorn, aber auch zum Podcast findest du unter unicornconsulting.com. Und jetzt wünsche ich euch viel Spaß beim Zuhören.
He says that ChatGPT can do 80% of the work for him. You know, he'll ask it to create the text and then he'll come in, check it, edit it, make sure it's all okay, kind of act as the editor. And he's only doing the final 20% of the work. I say from my conversations, not everybody is comfortable with that because you don't know where that text has come from exactly. And so, you know, not everybody wants to go that far as using text.
So today we have a very special topic, one topic that is very much, in the public eye at the moment, AI and how this will potentially affect and impact investor relations. So we have a very special guest with us today, Tim Human. Tim Human is senior reporter at the IR magazine. Most of you probably have heard of IR magazine before. In fact, they also have their own podcast. And he rejoined the publication in 2019 after 2 years working as a freelancer writer for a range of international clients, including the Economist Intelligence Unit. Previously, he was the editor of the IR magazine between 2013 and 2017, and he has also written for the Corporate Secretary IR magazine's sister publication and Corporate Comms, the UK-based magazine for corporate communication professionals. So, Tim, I think I can say that you have quite some experience within the field of corporate communications and publishing and working for magazines in that very niche industry that we are finding ourselves in. So welcome to Street Views, welcome to the show. I would like to give the audience you the chance to introduce yourselves a little bit, what your role is at IR Magazine and also what your touch point is with today's topic, AI in investor relations.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the podcast today. Really a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I'm senior reporter with IR Magazine. So I've been with IR Magazine for a long time, over 10 years now, writing about investor relations news, trends, attending events. And so, as you say, really focused on this part of the capital markets. And in terms of the topic that we're talking about today, I mean, it's got to be the number one question that we're being asked about by IR teams at the moment. How can they use artificial intelligence technology to help them in their day-to-day jobs? So we've been looking at this very closely at IR Magazine. We've actually been running some working groups of IROs in different locations. So in Toronto, in New York, and in London. And so we're getting IROs together, asking them, how they're experimenting with AI, talking through some of the different processes they can use. And the idea of this is that we're going to come out of it with an implementation checklist for IR teams to help them apply AI technology in their jobs.
Yeah, really interesting. Honestly, really curious to see the results. I'll definitely be amongst the readers of that. I was wondering exactly, now you've selected a pool of candidates, but in general, what has been the level of interest among IR professionals in the field of AI at this moment in time?
It's really high, I'd say. It's probably as I was saying, the number one question we're getting asked about, aside from ESG, the other topic that everybody is talking about at the moment. Those questions tend to fall into two areas, I'd say. First of all, people want to know how they can practically apply this. So sort of what aspects of their job might this be useful for? For example, is it useful for creating content, when you need to write a press release or even do a social media post, something like that? Can it help you with ideas? Also, around summarization of information, that's what people would like to know about. So there's a few different areas that it can help you with your job. So the other set of questions are around security. And so we all know that I think IR teams, they're not the first department to necessarily embrace new technology when it's available. And I think that's very understandable. Because of the compliance issues that exist around the role. Having said that, obviously there's lots of IR teams that are interested in experimenting with new technology. And Julia, I know this is something that you are always encouraging in terms of working more on, digital media, for example. That companies want to know how they can use AI technology safely and in a fashion that's not going to cause compliance issues. So those are the kind of two areas that we're getting these questions on mainly.
Very interesting. It's also, I mean, I'm not obviously an AI expert, but I also try to get, closer to the topic as I'm experimenting, as you said, a lot with the kind of digital tools and stuff. And the questions that I also receive a lot is like, okay, I understand that AI can help, but in this specific field that we are navigating around, right? Capital markets is a lot about like maybe even insider information. It's confidential information. Like how can I actually use these tools like ChatGPT, because I don't want to put in my unreleased numbers in there, So I think really in this landscape that we are navigating, and I could really imagine that there are a lot of question marks around this. So it's really great that you kind of shed some light into this and how people can actually do this on a practical basis. Maybe just to pick up people, and maybe I can also give my 10 cents on that, but I'm curious to hear what you're saying. When we're speaking about AI, what are we actually talking about? Like, are we talking here about generative AI? Are we talking about the wide field of AI? There's so many applications. Or how would you define when we talk really about AI?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because as you say, like, what are we talking about when we say artificial intelligence? And it's a term that gets used so much now, and it gets referred to in terms of so many different products that we hear about too that can help public companies. I think like AI in general is something that's been around for a very long time and is a very broad term, and it just refers to any something that can do a task that a human would normally do is how it's often described as. So that could be something like making decisions, could be data analysis. And, that kind of technology has been around and is used in all sorts of things that we use every day, from, Google Maps to Spotify recommendations, all of those kind of things. But as you alluded to, generative AI is something that's newer, that we've been talking about a lot more this year. I say generative AI refers to when, the AI can generate data. So normally we think of that as text, but it can also be referring to generating images, generating videos, any kind of data really. And so that's what's got people really excited this year is the potential there for how that could help us, because with that generative quality, it can really kind of become like an assistant to IR teams. So it could potentially help with all sorts of different tasks and maybe make IR teams a lot more productive. Of course, it comes with a lot of risks as well that we can talk about in this podcast. But yeah, that's the area that obviously everyone is super excited about, particularly around ChatGPT.
A great assistant for a day-to-day kind of business. That would be nice to have, to be honest. And when you think about these like day-to-day activities the team would have, I mean, you gave us a few ideas earlier when it comes to like press releases, et cetera. But what would you say are your go-to examples of use cases of generative AI in this case?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ones. I'll try and group them into a few different areas. And I'd say that this is something that is completely in flux at the moment, because everyone is experimenting with it, right? In their companies, seeing what it can do. So there's new use cases popping up all the time. But one of the key ones is around content creation. So maybe as an initial point, it can help people with ideas. So say you're trying to brainstorm ideas for doing something, such as, like I say, putting together some social media posts, putting together a press release, something like that. You've got a blank sheet of paper. What are some ideas that you could have to get started with that? So that's one way that you could use generative AI to help you. Some people will go further and ask it to create the text for them and use that as a starting point. So for example, one IR person I spoke to recently, when he's doing social media posts, he says that ChatGPT can do 80% of the work for him. He'll ask it to create the text, and then he'll come in, check it, edit it, make sure it's all okay, kind of act as the editor. And he's only doing the final 20% of the work. I say from my conversations, not everybody is comfortable with that, because you don't know where that text has come from exactly. And so, not everybody wants to go that far as using text from a generative AI tool. They want to maybe just use it for idea generation. But that's one area in terms of text. I say another area that we're seeing IR teams use this is around images and presentations and slides. And so, when you're trying to put together a presentation, when you have the data, corporate images, graphs, quotes, all that kind of thing, there's different tools out there. And I'd say not so much ChatGPT here, but other specific tools for presentations and slides where you can put all the information in, and it will just generate a very professional looking presentation for you very quickly. And for some IROs who say work at smaller companies where they maybe wear a few different hats and they're more involved in some of the design or working with external designers, for example, this is an area where they've started to use this tool, and it's really helped them a lot. So that's one thing we've been hearing. So that's content generations. That's just one thing. Maybe moving on to the big area, I'd say, for IR teams, it's summarization of information, right? So IR teams need to distill lots of information all the time, whether that's information that they're creating based around their own meetings, or whether it's, competitive intelligence, reading your peers' earnings transcripts, press releases, reading analyst notes and things like that. There's a lot of information that you need to absorb. And so people are using this to put that information into something like ChatGPT and asking it to summarize the key points, right? And then you could get through that information hopefully much more quickly. And one IRO talked to me about doing this after an investment conference. They went to an investment conference, they spent all day taking notes, had pages of notes, right? And they wanted that just summarized very quickly in a couple of seconds. What were the 5 key takeaways that came out of all these meetings? And they asked ChatGPT to do that, and they were relatively happy with the results. So there's a kind of summarization of information is a really important area too. I'll mention a couple more. Like I could keep going on. I don't want to like I say, it could basically help with anywhere, but a few other ones, potential questions that a company might be asked. You can ask generative AI to take on a persona. So you can ask it to say, take on a persona of a fund manager, of an investment analyst, and then ask it questions in that context. And you get much more specific answers, hopefully the kind of questions that you might get, from an actual investment professional. And there's continuous kind of improvement, something that you've already published. Maybe you want to put it in and ask, how could I have done this better? Maybe you wrote a script. You can't put it in beforehand because it's non-public information, and that's very risky, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure. But maybe a script that you've already published, put it into ChatGPT. How could this have been better? And then one other thing, I heard a company had used it for translation. So they wanted to reach out to sort of Spanish-speaking stakeholder group with some of their communications. Obviously, you can use a translator here. They used ChatGPT, and then they got the output checked by a native speaker, and they said it was really good for that. So yeah, I don't know, from content generation, summarization, all of these other areas, there's so many different ways that IR teams are experimenting with generative AI at the moment, which is really interesting.
Nice. So many, I had to take actually notes, which very rarely happens because there are so many things that I do want to add, but also have follow-up questions. But we're going to stick, first of all, I think, to our script here. I think the presentation thing was super interesting. Maybe you can, in the next question, we anyways going to talk about the very concrete AI tools that you can recommend. So maybe you can help us to name that specific tool. And in terms of what you said with social media, I tend to agree. I think it's good to have a starting point to kind of get ideas running, maybe even to write like an outline of a post. But the experience that I made is you can hear if it's written by AI, or at least I can see it. Maybe I've seen too many posts by now, but it's not 100% yet replacing a human, And I think this is also the message that I always try to give, is that it does help you and it does really leverage your own time and the time of your team, but it does not replace a human, right? I think there's still like the translation work that needs to be done to make it like a fully fledged output. But yeah, maybe the next question that I already alluded to is, what concrete AI tools can investor relations managers use that you would recommend specifically? Absolutely.
No, first of all, I completely agree with you that it's not in any way replacing investor relations professionals, at the moment, or probably in the future either. There's always going to need that human oversight, for one thing, of the output. But also there's so much of the IR role which is relationship based, which I don't think you would want to delegate to a machine anyway, right? That wouldn't be very successful. But in terms of the specific, some specific tools, in terms of the presentation ones, the ones that I'd heard about, one was called Beautiful AI, which had been recommended. I think there's another one called Slides AI as well, which somebody else had used. Yeah.
I tried this beautiful AI and the output was not so great it was okay, but it doesn't replace the good skills that me and Caroline, when we were grinding slides back then at About You and Delivery Hero, it wasn't as good, I have to say, but okay, fair enough. It's maybe a starting point as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'd heard. It was an IR professional who said they were using it. They'd actually didn't need to work so much with an external designer because they'd been using beautiful AI. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it depends. And I think as a general point, like the output of these tools at this point is not always super professional. It needs a lot of checking and additional work on it. So that's something to bear in mind. Maybe just talking about some of the tools without mentioning specific ones, but the kind of tools that are being developed for investor relations professionals specifically. I think this is a really important area because at the end of the day, we're not all going to learn, how to use these tools directly and, how to do sort of extensive prompt engineering, which is when you learn how the different instructions can be most effective within a generative AI tool. So I think that the tools that come out of the IR services space, we're just ready to use, making the use of this technology, but you don't necessarily need to learn how to use it yourself, are going to be really important. So some of these are being based around the earnings process. So we're seeing sort of earnings assistant type tools coming out. So this is where, say, for example, before your earnings call, it is helping to, again, summarize, distill the information that you're going to need to prepare for that. What are the conversations in the market? What are your peers saying? What are the likely questions you could be asked? And then after you've had your results announcement, your immediate kind of or quick feedback on that. So looking at your transcript, maybe even looking at the audio of your call. So analyzing how your executives have spoken. Did they speak quickly? Did they use too many positive words? And giving you feedback on that. And it's the kind of thing I think that IR professionals will pick up on anyway, most of the time. But it really could potentially provide like a checks and balance. Like it'll reaffirm that answer that your CEO gave about potential acquisition activity wasn't very convincing or created a bit of uncertainty, right? And the compute.
And then you can also blame the machine, right? You don't have to tell. You don't have to tell me yourself.
I mean, we all know about how to get your message across is very important in investor relations, isn't it? So so absolutely. So that's one kind of area around results and earnings. I'd say there's some more kind of out there tools as well. I mean, we've seen things like voice cloning technology, which we all know about already because we hear about sort of deep fake videos, and we've used it at iMagazine events. We've had people speak and then it comes across like Snoop Dogg is saying it, and Snoop Dogg announces the lunch break at one of our events. We've done stuff like that with voice cloning. But there are tools where, say, your CEO can go into a studio for 2 or 3 hours, have their voice recorded, and then from that, they can produce any speech they want, using that technology. And you'd never have to pre-record anything ever again. I think this raises a lot of interesting questions around what's too far and how the importance of authenticity in your communications, right? So I don't know how the market would react knowing that, a CEO speech was completely computer generated, right? But anyway, those are some of the tools that are sort of being developed and are being made available to public companies for their corporate communications at the moment.
Honestly, some of the things that you've just mentioned are many of the things I would love to have already right now, and which also came to our mind back in the days. Like there were already some tools that we were using that were collecting the kind of data that you could leverage to then do this next step. And you'd always wish for like, oh, could they not do exactly like propose me the questions? Do I really have to read through all the like 300 lines of text? So no, honestly, when this becomes exactly a bit more safe, a bit more like tested, I would be amongst the first to say, yes, please, I want it. But exactly, like there are still some risks and issues that we've mentioned. I was wondering if you could, like you said, the security of the data, but what are some other risks and issues that exactly like someone like myself could be facing when looking into AI and how to implement it into my day-to-day IR activities?
Sure, absolutely. I think security, as you mentioned, is the big one. And I think, everyone in the IR world, there's been enough conversation around generative AI that people understand that you shouldn't put anything non-public, into these tools at the moment, because then that information is used to train the model, and it can be spat out in some form or even in a complete form based on somebody else's request for information in the future. And so anything that's either non-public or you consider to be sensitive in some way shouldn't be entered when you're using these tools. I think the hope and what people are working towards is that there'll be private versions of these tools in the future, right? And so there'll be a sort of an area where you can upload information securely, but still use the analysis based on what's happening in the wider market to inform the recommendations that it provides. And so that's something that almost certainly we're going to get to in the future, but it's not available at the moment. So security, really big issue still.
I mean, if you think about all the data that, it's not even that it's unsafe, but a lot of data is you have to pay for when it's like analyst coverage or transcripts from the different calls. Like much of this information is not available on the web, but you can access it through different like databases that you pay for. And then, for example, this is kind of data that would be amazing to have linked to these kind of AI features.
Absolutely, yeah. Bringing it all together and then being able to use it in advance of releasing things. I think that people would find that extremely useful when we get to that point. Another thing, we've already touched on this, but another big sort of barrier that people face is accuracy. I mean, as you mentioned, anyone who's used these tools and tried to get it to, I don't know, tell me about myself or tell me about something I know about already, and then reading the output and seeing that it's not very accurate, and sometimes it makes things up completely. And so to what extent can you trust, the output of these tools? And that's why I say some people are reluctant even to use it for text generation at the moment, because you're not sure how accurate that is. You're not sure if that's been used somewhere else and it's being regurgitated. And so accuracy is something that holds people back. Another area is budget. As you mentioned, this costs money, right? I mean, especially when we're talking about different data sources, within companies, depending on how they're set up, use of AI is going to involve lots of different departments, of course, from, the IT department to the legal department. There need to be resources behind this that could support the IR department when it's experimenting with this. At the same time, I would say budget is there's two sides to it, because as we've discussed, there are some areas, maybe like design work, maybe like translation work, where this could actually save you money now, if you're happy with the results. And so this is something where it could, it's going to cost more in some situations, but it could save companies money in other situations too.
Mm-hmm. Also, again, I had to take notes because I have two remarks to make. So I think there's already a few companies in the, let's say, broader finance space, right, that are experimenting or kind of building proposition on the back of generative AI and also the data that they have. For example, I think Morgan Stanley did this for their private wealth management, right, already. But also Bloomberg, I think, if I recall correctly, did already build a AI based upon their own proprietary data, which I think is super cool and interesting. To touch upon what Caroline said, that to have access to those data, but also to have access to the World Wide Web and kind of combine that. And then the other point I wanted to raise before we move on to the next question is, how about the topic of copyright and kind of data protection, like if you're taking out the text from GPT or you're taking out the picture from Midjourney, like, are you actually allowed to use them, for example, for your annual report? Are there any property rights, included that you need to adhere to? Do you have any thoughts on that one?
For what I understand, and I'm not an expert on sort of copyright in general, but from what I understand, it's very much like a live question, this. And so, we don't have a lot of clarity around, whether the information being produced here, it does belong to somebody or not. And you may have seen in the press recently, but a lot of authors, are suing OpenAI about ChatGPT because they say that it's been trained on their work, basically. And as a side, I don't know if you've seen this, but Amazon has decided to limit the number of novels or books that people can self-publish on its platform to 3 a day, because people are trying to publish so many books on Amazon, and it's all generative AI. And what people are doing is they're saying, rewrite, take a famous novel, rewrite it, change the title, and then publish it, right? And someone actually published more than 50 books in one day on Amazon. So there's a huge kind of potential copyright issues here. It's a really important question. Something that people need to talk to their legal departments about, and something, if your company has an AI policy, it's something that this could address. But yeah, there's not a lot of clarity and a good reason to be cautious about copyright issues at the moment when using generative AI tools.
Okay, maybe we have 2 last questions. So the second last one is, how will AI technology affect the IR role? I think many in general, not just IR roles, are concerned obviously about their jobs because they think, we're going to get replaced. I think this concern we already could tackle, right, by saying that IR is also a lot about relationships. You cannot just put a machine and they will do all of the work. I think this is not really the case, at least from my perspective. But how will AI really affect the IR role in the future?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's going to affect a lot more for IROs than just how they do their jobs in terms of how you conduct IR activities and how productive you can be. It's affecting everything related to the IR role. I think like key area is how your company is messaging around artificial intelligence, right? So if you look at tools that measure how often certain terms are mentioned on earnings transcripts, which are AI-powered tools normally, by the way, they'll tell you that artificial intelligence is being mentioned by executives more and more and more on earnings calls, especially this year. And so companies,
I think it boosts the stock if you mention AI. Like investors will think, this has more value.
Yeah, and it can either be about opportunity, this is how this is going to support us, or it can be more trying to allay kind of worries about your business model. I think it was back in May this year that education companies suffered quite heavy share price losses on the back of the emergence of ChatGPT, basically. And what happens if people start using these tools which have all of the information that a student needs, and you can interface with it like a tutor, right? What does that mean for education companies, right? And so those companies suffered big share price falls. So it's going to really, companies need to think a lot about how they're going to talk about artificial intelligence with their investors. So that's one thing. So another big issue that people talk about a lot is how are we going to deal with all of the fake information that's going to be produced by these tools, right? And I already mentioned it a bit in terms of what's happening on Amazon's self-publishing platform, but things like deep fake videos, fake press releases, we're going to just have absolutely tons of this, and it's going to become more and more sophisticated. And so companies are going to have to make sure that, the information that they're releasing is getting to the people that they want it to, and those people know that that's the authentic information direct from the company. And so I think we're going to have to develop better systems for verification and, making sure that information that's being received is authentic. But there's just absolutely going to be huge amounts of fake information out there that companies are going to have to deal with when they're trying to tell their own story.
Yeah, that's for sure. I can totally imagine if they start posting material on Twitter or other social platforms that look exactly as they would have. It will take also some education, both from the receiving end, but also from who's publishing it, to make sure that they let everyone be aware of what is their source of true information. And to that extent, it leads us to a bit going back to what we started with as a final question. So the piece that you're currently writing about your advice on how to get started with AI from different IR teams and people who are using AI these days. Of course, without killing the scoop of the story when it comes out, but maybe you could give us a little preview to our audience of what you think are some ways to get started.
Sure, absolutely. We still have one of the working groups to go at the current time. And so once those are all completed, that's when we'll be putting together a report based on all the findings. But yeah, maybe I could give 3 sort of pieces of advice for IR teams that want to get started with using AI more in their day-to-day jobs. One of them is, if you haven't already, just give it a go. Go and open a ChatGPT or a Bard, a Google Bard account, for example. Just start playing around with it. Start asking it questions. See what it can come up with. Ask it to do some tasks for you and see how useful it is. One of the things that you can use it for is you can ask it to explain how best to make it work. If you want it to do something, ask it, how do you take on the persona of a sell-side analyst, for example, and it will explain then how you can do that. So just start playing around with it, I'd say, as a first point. The second, which is related to that, which we mentioned a bit before, is to learn a little bit about prompt engineering. I kind of, using ChatGPT, I found it was a little bit like Excel or something like that, in that when you look at it, you don't really know what it can do, but there's so many like potential functions for it. But you need somebody to explain a little bit about the right way to ask questions and what the capabilities are. And so study a little bit about prompt engineering, and that will just enable you to get so much more out of using these tools when you do try them out. And then I say the third thing is just to try and get involved in discussions within your company about this. And so does your company have a working group about covering AI use? Does it have an AI policy? Who's putting that together? Can you be involved in those discussions? Just try and be involved in that, because these are all live discussions happening right now, involving lots of different departments. And I think it'd be really good for IR people to be involved in that and to be bringing the capital markets angle to those discussions. And I think that'll help to make sure these tools can be put to the best use for IR in the future. And yeah, those are the kind of areas that we'll be talking about in our report when we release it as well.
We can't wait. Will this be a free report, or you have to be probably a subscriber to our magazine, right?
To be honest, I don't actually know at this point how it will be published. But that's something I could look into and get back to you on.
Interesting. No, we cannot wait for the report to release either way. Thank you so much, Tim, for being on the show. It has been super insightful. It's also a topic that I'm deeply interested in. So thank you so much for your thoughts and your knowledge in that field. And speak soon.
Absolute pleasure to be on the show. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
So, wir sind jetzt auch schon wieder am Ende des Podcasts angekommen. Ich hoffe, dir hat diese Episode gefallen. Wenn du Hilfe brauchst bei irgendwelchen Kapitalmarktthemen oder digitalen Investor Relations Themen, dann melde dich gerne unter unicornconsulting.com und buch dir einen ersten freien Consulting Call. Wir würden uns ebenfalls darüber freuen, wenn du uns auf Social Media folgst, zum Beispiel YouTube, TikTok, Instagram oder auch LinkedIn, oder wenn du einfach einen Like da lässt. Ich wünsche euch alles Gute und bis zum nächsten Mal. Eure Julia. Ciao.